Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Sotloff, the director of the Institute. Thank you very much for joining us on short notice. This is an event that we wish we weren't convening at the Institute, an event that we called on short notice to address the issues of the day. We titled this Iraq's Dire Situation. My own view is that that's a bit of an understatement. If Churchill might have said that this is a debacle wrapped in a tragedy inside of a catastrophe. And even that might be only a bit approaching the reality of the situation facing first and foremost the Iraqi people and more broadly security and stability in the region and American interests throughout this area. I am very pleased that we at the Washington Institute have a deep bench of expertise to bring to bear on understanding the situation in Iraq and more broadly today, and in offering some suggestions to address the situation between the government of Iraq and the United States and its allies around the region, and the messaging from Washington throughout the Middle East. In that regard, I'm very pleased to recognize the Ambassador of Iraq who's here today. Thank you for joining us. I know that there's a lot on your plate, and I'm delighted that you're with us for today's session. Let me just introduce our panelists, and then we'll get down to today's business. First, I'm pleased to introduce Jim Jeffrey. Jim is our Philip Sollins Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at the Institute. Jim, of course, served the United States with distinction as ambassador in Baghdad, in addition to service as ambassador in Ankara. Much earlier in his career, ambassador in Albania, served as deputy national security advisor in the Bush administration. Jim has a lifetime of experience in American foreign policy and diplomacy, based on an original foundation of military experience that harkens all the way back to Vietnam. Perhaps not a metaphor for today's events, or perhaps they are, and Jim will offer insight into that. Speaking later in our program, sitting to Jim's right, is Aaron Zellin. Aaron is the Washington Institute's Richard Burrow Fellow, and I think it's fair to say that there are exceedingly few people in or outside of government who have followed the development of what President Obama now calls ISIL, what some other experts call ISIS, but it is the same radical extremist terrorist group that we're talking about. And Aaron, through his really minute and detailed exploration of these groups, brings extraordinary value added to our understanding of what is going on in Iraq and Syria. And then joining us from Orly Airport in Paris is Michael Knights, the Institute's Lafer International Fellow, who is, I think, as this audience knows, one of the finest observers of political military issues in Iraq, has been a voice of incisive and insightful analysis on the situation going back many, many years. I'm delighted that Mike can join us, and I think because Mike is under some technical constraints, that we're going to begin our program, if that's all right. We're going to begin our program with Mike, and then turn to Jim, and then to Aaron. So Mike, Larissa, if we can just address that noise. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rob. I've certainly transmitted from worse places than this, so I should be with you for the hour, I hope. So, Larissa, I think you have a graphic that you were going to put up. Thanks very much. So Larissa, there we go, background noise gone. If you look at this graphic, and apologise for anyone at the...
1 second.
Just tell me when.
I don't... Go ahead.
Okay, testing. You hear me okay now? I'll continue to speak. So the map that you see in front of you gives some basic areas of control now. The green map, the green area that you can see is the unarguable 3 provinces of the Kurdistan region government area of Iraq. The large black area is the area in which government control has largely collapsed. That doesn't mean it's an ISIS control area. That means that no one else is in control of the area. So it may be ISIS, it may be scattered government forces, it may be local militant actors in those areas. And just to briefly explain the lines that you're looking at, the lines on this map show a red line or an orange line, which was the Peshmerga's forward edge of control just before this June crisis. And now you see a light blue line, which is their current forward positions. And it demonstrates how they've moved forward along pretty much the entire disputed line, encompassing almost all, or at least very many of the disputed areas that they claim, certainly the ones that they care most about. And then where you see the black area of loss of control end at the bottom of the map, you see a pencil-thin corridor from Samarra, which is the stop line, the defensive line, where hopefully the tide will be stemmed. Balad, the Air Force base where the F-16s were supposed to go, but they may now be relocated somewhere else when they arrive later in the year. And Taji, right at the bottom of the map, which is the refitting and rally point for the destroyed units, a major logistical base in that area. And as can be seen from this, I want to point out 2 things about the way the battlefield is evolving at the moment. First, looking at strategic geometry. If you look at it, ISIS in Mosul have got great strategic depth in terms of the distance that the federal forces, once reconstituted, would have to travel between Baghdad and Mosul. Tremendous strategic depth, 350 kilometers of contested terrain. But ISIS's west-east strategic depth is actually very limited. And that really underlines the potential role the Kurds could play. ISIS has 350 kilometers of strategic depth north to south, but they've got in many places as little as 10 to 30 kilometers of strategic depth west to east. The key things that they want to hold on to are within very close striking distance of Kurdish forces. And this really underlines how vital it is to get the Kurds fully into this fight. And that means that the government has to come to the Kurds with a solution on some of their revenue sharing and oil authority issues. And Baghdad has to make some compromises. We can all argue about the fine points later, but for now, there's a bigger issue to deal with. The Kurds are already fighting at a number of points of the map. For instance, Hawija, which you see just west of Kirkuk, where Peshmerga ground forces are working with remnants of the federal security forces and federal air power. Likewise, where the Kurds have moved forward to take control of these disputed areas, the Iraqi army buffer between them and ISIS is now gone. So they are undertaking, they're taking casualties. You can see martyrdom statements coming up on Kurdish social media sites and news sites showing that the Kurds are in the fight against ISIS. And it couldn't ever be any other way. The Kurdish leadership hate radical Islamists. They suffered extensively from their depredations in the past, and they're not willing to have a major ISIS control center within an hour's distance drive of Erbil, which is the economic capital of Kurdistan. No successful emerging economy in the world has been able to have a huge Al-Qaeda presence in a city of 1.8 million people just an hour's drive away. So this will not be acceptable to the Kurds, but we need to swing them fully into the fight, and that means a political deal. The second brief observation I want to make is We need to pay a lot of attention to the moral dimension of this crisis. By my estimation, speaking to people in Iraq, a full 60 of the 243 Iraqi army battalions, combat battalions, cannot be accounted for now. 60 out of 243 cannot be accounted for right now, with all equipment lost. So this is a mammoth refitting job to put these units back together and to arm them properly for combat. And this is an area where the US will, I'm sure, once again become the arsenal of democracy. No one likes the idea of having to refit the Iraqi army yet again after the US taxpayer did it the first time. This time Iraq will be paying. So anyway, one aspect of this is the refitting role. But as important as that, turning around a defeated army and enabling it to fight again, and I've embedded with the Iraqi security forces. They're a military with a long tradition, quite a proud tradition. Amongst Arab countries, they're one of the best militaries, and they have many proud achievements to point to, including defeat of the militias in 2008 and their part in the surge, which defeated Al-Qaeda the first time. But they need to be turned around. As any commander will tell you, the acme of skill for a military commander is to take a defeated army and turn it around. If you look at Viscount Slim of Burma, his account of turning the defeated British army around, which is called Defeat, these points are laid out in great detail, and it's one of the most difficult tasks you can imagine. This is where the US can play a key role. It wouldn't take that many US commanders embedded at divisional level and above to insert some wisdom into the way that the Iraqi securities pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and get back into the fight. One of the key elements of this is taking baby steps, feeding these units in a way that they can win small successes, small easy battles that rebuilds their confidence for the larger battles which will come as they get further north. The final thing I'll say as well is that the provision of US military assistance on the ground is something that we need to think very seriously about, as I'm sure the President is. Having listened to his remarks, I hope what I'm detecting there is that we're playing hardball with the Iraqi government about coming out with a political deal, about ending all of this sectarian nonsense, ethnic bullying of the Kurds. If some of the very disruptive Iraqi government policies can end, I hope we are willing to help out this long-standing ally. If we put US air power into Iraq right now, it's not a silver bullet that will solve everything, but it would have tremendous moral effect in terms of supporting the Iraqi military. They know what US air power can do. It's a massive boost to them whenever they know that there's some US air power at their backs ready to help them out if things get really, really tough. You don't need to use a lot of it for it to have a tremendous amount of moral impact. And for people who say, but how can we be sure where the strikes are getting targeted? Don't we need people on the ground? I have to honestly say, yes, we do. We do need a Joint Special Operations Task Force on the ground. It doesn't need to be massive, but we do need eyes on the ground. When we turned around the Libyan regime's near destruction of the rebels at Benghazi, when the French airstrikes and other airstrikes turned that around, that had enormous effect. And there are many instances in Iraq where I can imagine a little bit of air power going a very long way. Now, we've already got boots on the ground in Iraq, the people at the embassy, including the military training mission. So I really wish this boots on the ground phrase would leave our lexicon, because it just doesn't mean anything. It's an excuse not to do something. We already have boots on the ground. Use whatever legal conceit is required to get some US advisors up to the forward headquarters and to get them on the front line. And I'll say this with the caveat, they could already be there right now, but they're keeping it low. If that's the case, fine. But if it's not the case, it's something we should very seriously consider. If I have space for just one final comment, it's not hard at this stage to imagine Iraq becoming Syria. And by that I mean northwestern Iraq going the same way as Raqqa in Syria, under ISIS control, perhaps semi-permanently, like Fallujah, just 35 kilometers from Baghdad International Airport. it's also not hard to imagine the Iraqi government, if we don't give them sufficient backing, turning to somebody who has a proven track record of protecting their allies, and that's the Iranians. They, through themselves and Lebanese Hezbollah, stabilized the Assad regime's defense. And, you know, it's unfortunate, but when I was in Baghdad in March speaking to the top level leaders, what I heard is that the Iraqi government feels it needs to use some of the same formula that Assad did, and maybe some of the same helpers as well. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Shiite Islamist militias. So really, this is the time for a desperate plea to the US government on behalf of all the Iraqis out there who are willing to fight hard. The US needs to make a credible gesture at this time, a credible gesture of military support right now. And if we're using the withholding of military support as a lever on the Iraqi government to come up with some kind of political deal, good. But I hope there's the baseline determination underneath that to eventually do something to stabilize the situation. It can't be a cosmetic half measure. We've had too many of them, I think, in recent years. We have to commit to the defense of Iraq. And we can't leave Iraq to ISIS or to the Iranians. And those are really my comments.
And Jim, do you want to speak from the podium?
I'll speak from here if it's okay. Oh, well, no.
Because I put the map back up.
Oh, okay.
So it might be useful while...
Yeah, the map's great. Okay. Mike, what I'm going to say is going to parallel, not surprisingly, much of what you said. First of all, everybody, thanks for coming here today. About 2 months ago, it seems like 2 years ago, when I was diverted from my main job looking at the Middle East into Ukraine, I wrote something saying that the Crimean situation was the biggest challenge to the United States since 9/11, if not since the end of the Cold War. I've changed my opinion. What's happening right now in Iraq is the biggest challenge to the United States and the international order since 9/11 at least. And here's why. Back in September, President Obama addressed the UN General Assembly. And he said, in the Middle East, which is still a cauldron of most of our security concerns and a large percent of our troops, there were 4 critical issues that would require all elements of American power, a euphemism, of course, for military force. Securing the oil lines, combating international terror, standing by our allies and partners, and weapons of mass destruction. Other than the last, at least for the moment, all 3 of the others are very much in play right now. The largest concentration of al-Qaeda we have ever seen anywhere, compared to Pakistan, Yemen, you name it, is in this combined area of western Iraq and on into Syria. And they are the nastiest of all of them. Secondly, we've already seen oil prices spike. Iraq is the second largest exporter of oil in OPEC. The IEA estimates it could go up to 6 million barrels of production a day, 2/3 of what Saudi Arabia on some days produces by 2020, if it remains stable. This is not a recipe, folks, for stability. Granted, the oil fields are in the Kurdish north or in the deep Shia south around Basra, but in all kinds of ways I won't get into, but trust me on this, if there is instability in Iraq, and particularly if we have no government worthy of the name in Baghdad, you're not going to have a whole lot of development in the oil sector anywhere, except perhaps in Kurdistan. So our interests are very much at stake. Clearly the President and the U.S. government realizes that. He's talked twice about this. Let's try to take a look at the factors that he's being briefed on. I'll keep it short, and I'll keep it to what General Casey used to call the major muscle movements, because at this point, that's what we should do. Speed is of the essence, and a lot of the things I and everybody in this audience could say about Iraq that is relevant and true isn't important at this point. There are only, in the next few days, and we're talking about days here, a few things that are really crucially important by the major actors, and there are 6. Most importantly, there's ISIL, and we'll hear more from Mr. Zellin in a second on what makes them up. They're facing a decision. They've seized almost all of the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq. The question is, do they carry out their threat and go after Kabbalah, Najaf, and try to besiege Baghdad? They certainly can. I know the area to the north and to the south of Baghdad. It still is an area of where al-Qaeda has always had a presence. It's mixed Sunni Shia areas, and they've already this morning seized two of the towns in Diyala province to the north and to the northeast of Baghdad. So they could pretty much cut it off from Salman Pak to the north, to the southeast, all the way around towards Bakuba to the northeast. And the problem is, even if they can't take the city, and I'll get to that in a second, I don't think they can, the question is, how do you get fuel, food, water, electricity, and all the other things a country, a capital, 5 or 6 million people, and an army needs if they're surrounding you? I'm not speaking theoretically. In 2004, with 130,000 American troops in country, that was the situation we faced not most days, but some days in Baghdad in June, July, August, being hit by the al-Qaeda people from the west and the Shia militias from the south and out of Sadr City. And it was very, very tough, even though we had all these troops and we had overwhelming air power. I'll come back to that. So ISIL needs to make a decision. We'll have to see what they're going to do. That's the most important thing, because if they do decide to stay in the Sunni areas, then we're going to have a classic counterinsurgency. The things Mike laid out that will need to be done for reconciliation, some of what the president said today, all true. American troops are not going to liberate the Sunni areas of Iraq. That's going to be Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia or nobody. We'll provide the logistics, we'll provide the training, and we can provide overwhelming firepower in the months ahead. But I don't think we're going to do it, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it. Because if they're not going to fight for their own country, then we shouldn't on the ground, because it would be bloody. But that's a long-term, as history goes, question. If ISIL is pushing towards Baghdad, the president is faced with a very different situation, given, as Michael said, we've got a large contingent of Americans right in the middle of this thing, and given what can happen to Baghdad and how the other actors, the other 5 actors, play. The first of them is the government, the Iraqi army, which is not entirely but largely composed of Shia ground soldiers, and some of the Shia militias that are also in this mix. If together they can hold, maintain their cohesion, use their vastly superior firepower and their extraordinarily large number of superiority in troops to hold territory where their families live, then we won't have to worry about a siege. They'll be able to push these people back and keep enough roads open. It'll be messy, as it often was in 2004, but they can do it. But that's a big if, folks, from what we've seen in Mosul and elsewhere. If they can't, that is, looking at the first of the 6 elements, if ISIS decides option B, to go for Baghdad, to surround it, and if the authorities are not able to break that siege, I'm sure they're strong enough to avoid being overrun. A city of 6 million people is not going to be overrun by 800 or 2,000 or 5,000 people. I'm almost sure of that. But they may not be able to maneuver, use firepower, coordinate effectively against people who are very good at this time, and they may find themselves essentially besieged. So if you get through those 2 decision points, you get to the other 4 actors. The next one is the Kurds. They're now, as Michael said, sitting on a new green line that includes most of the mixed areas with this Kurdish populations. To quote Masoud Barzani to me at one point, if there is danger anywhere a Kurd is living, there will be the Peshmerga. And that's essentially what we have right now. So they have 2 other choices, depending upon how things go in Baghdad, how things go in the country. They can, as you can see, they are on either side of Mosul. They're right along the fault lines where the ISIL are. They can move forward, push these people back. They have a lot of heavy equipment. They have well-trained troops. And they can exert tremendous military pressure on ISIL if they want to. On the other hand, if they see a total mess, disintegration, Iranian domination to the south, they're out of Iraq Inc., in my view. They've talked about this for years. They've opened certain options, but that's something to watch. So they've got decisions too, based upon these other decisions. The next actor is the Iranians. If Baghdad is besieged, if some of these cities that are so important to Shia Islam in the south, Kabbalah and Najaf, are under threat, it's very hard to imagine the Iranians not acting if somebody else doesn't act. And the consequences of a Shia-Sunni Gotterdammerung in the middle of the Middle East are just beyond calculation. Second to the last actor is the Turks. They're in a very awkward position because they have 80 people, including their entire consulate in Mosul, seized by the ISIL people. That puts limits on what they can do, but they are still a major actor with a major military capability and very close ties to the Kurds. So watch them. The final actor is the most important, and that's the United States. Many of you have just heard the president. It's a somewhat mixed message at this point. What he's saying is he's going to consult with Congress to look at his options. He ruled out ground forces, and when ruling out ground forces, he's talking about major ground forces, not necessarily forward air controller teams, trainers, and other things. He's already got military trainers on the ground or military advisors on the ground. He didn't rule out airstrikes, but he didn't rule it in either. What he said was, I can't do anything militarily without a political process. Again, going back to the first of the 6 actors, if ISIS stays in Sunni Arab Iraq, that's a totally intelligent, acceptable, and smart way to move forward, because all he can do is provide the aerial firepower for somebody's ground forces, and if that somebody's ground forces don't show up for the fight, there's no sense us dropping bombs on people. But if ISIS is moving south, if we're facing either a siege of Baghdad and almost certainly the Iranians coming in a big way, we have to act quickly. And then if what he's saying is essentially, I'm going to leverage my decision to use force to get the best possible political deal, that's smart politics, that's smart diplomacy, and more power to him. But if, having tried for 4 years in Iraq or outside of Iraq to get exactly this kind of reconciliation and political deal and failed miserably, if what he's telling us is until that happens, the planes will stay on the aircraft carriers in their fields and ISIS is moving forward, then other actors are going to shape Iraq and they're going to shape the Middle East while our planes remain on the ground. That's the question that he's facing today. One last thing before I'll stop. People will say, and Mike addressed it very, very well, well, what are we going to hit, what targets? 1972, the North Vietnamese invaded something called the Easter Offensive. It was exactly like 1975 where they overran the country, and in fact they were well on their way to overrunning the country even quicker than in 1975. And then the planes came. The F-4s, the B-52s. You could feel the ground rumble, and every Vietnamese soldier, ARVN soldier, could feel the ground rumble. Suddenly they stopped running and they started fighting. Bit by bit, they held their ground. Bit by bit, they threw back the North Vietnamese army until, by the Paris Peace Accords, all but one small town had been retaken in the entire country. We had people on the ground as forward observers, that's true, but nonetheless it was the use of military power, it was the use of air power, sometimes not knowing exactly where the enemy was, that turned the tide. Again, in Libya, many times we didn't have ground observers. But what we were dealing with were flying columns of highly mobile Gaddafi regular army troops. What we're dealing here with is essentially a pickup truck, and now pickup truck and Humvee army of ISIS people roaring around at 30 miles an hour. They're vulnerable to airstrikes. And there are ways to get forward observers in if it's the will of the United States to get them in. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Aaron?
Thanks for coming out and for everybody watching online. So I'm going to be talking about ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, and sort of get into the details of who they are, what they've been up to, and what we could potentially see. So this didn't necessarily come out of nowhere, even though it's sort of been portrayed as if it has. There's been a reemergence of ISIS, which originally is the group that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was in control of last decade, al-Qaeda in Iraq. They themselves have changed their name and rebranded over the years to try and have a better time operating in Iraq as well as in Syria more recently. So they started reemerging in April 2013. This is when ISIS decided to extend its control beyond Iraq and into Syria last year. This is also the time when they officially broke away from al-Qaeda itself. Al-Qaeda then, in early February 2014, confirmed that ISIS was no longer in the organization. The thing to remember about ISIS is that while the Sahwa movement and surge did push them back, they were not completely defeated. There was still at least 300 people that were killed per month in Iraq from around 2008 until April 2013. So what was important about Syria is that they were able to pour resources, get new money, as well as fighters back into Iraq when they were operating inside of Syria. One of the things that we've seen in the past 6 months or so is that there have been a return of foreign fighters into the Iraqi arena. Many of these originally just went to Syria to fight against the Assad regime, but from there, ISIS then plucked them and brought them into the Iraq zone to fight as well. Since April 2013, we've seen violence rise 3.5 times more than what we saw on average for the previous 4.5 years. In addition, one of the things that helped them out was that they had a prison break last July at Abu Ghraib, where at least 500 individuals were released from prison. Some of these guys were arrested and detained during the Sahwan surge timeframe. And many of these had experiences, and therefore that further provided more levels of competency to ISIS's operations. And, of course, we saw earlier this year that they were able to take over Fallujah and parts of Ramadi. Another additional aspect of what ISIS has been doing that we did not see last decade and is one of the reasons why people were in a backlash against them originally was that they've had a hearts and minds strategy, whether it's providing food, medicine, religious classes, outreach to tribal figures, as well as allowing people in the Sahwa movement to repent and join their cause without getting killed. Therefore, more and more victories has raised the level of prestige of this organization. ISIS operatives now operate in both Syria and Iraq and view the border as nothing more than going from one province in their Islamic state to another, not going from one nation state to the other. So after Mosul was liberated, and it should be noted that ISIS was not the only fighting force, there were also Baathists, Naqshbandis, as well as some other Islamist factions that were involved in the takeover. When ISIS takes over an area, they view it as now under their sovereign control, and therefore every individual within the territory must pledge bay'ah or allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the group. And if you don't go along with the program, you essentially you have a death wish. So this is the backdrop to how they plan to rule as well as what they're going to lay out. So yesterday morning, they released the Wathiqat al-Madina, or a charter of the city, to Maslawi residents. In it, it highlights more prohibitions on actions than things that people can potentially do. So if you steal, you'll get your hand chopped off. You have to perform all 5 daily prayers on time. Drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes are forbidden. Carrying non-ISIS flags and or weapons is illegal. All shrines and graves will be destroyed since ISIS views them as polytheistic. And women must dress modestly, which is just a euphemism for the full-body niqab. It also notes to Sunnis within the town that if they worked within the Maliki government and institutions, that if they repented, they would be fine and wouldn't be executed. We also already have a case study of how ISIS does rule in Syria. So I'm going to highlight some of the ways they've been in charge in addition to the criminal aspects. So it's not just all terror. They have a soft power aspect too. So when ISIS took over al-Raqqa in Syria, they started setting up by putting up a lot of billboards in the city that had themes related to jihad, Sharia, women's sacredness, and other themes related to piety. ISIS also tried to initially reach out to local notables and tribal figures because they wanted to blunt or stave off any potential backlash that could happen in the future, in the same way that we saw last decade in Iraq when there was the uprising against ISIS in the mid-2000s. what most people don't realize is that ISIS's operations are highly sophisticated, and they do have a bureaucracy themselves too. So I'm just going to go through sort of how they've actually been governing these areas in Syria. So in terms of the law and order side of things, they have Sharia courts. This is where they can throw down their rulings related to somebody getting their hand chopped off for thievery, or people getting summary executions for apostasy. And we've even seen a number of individuals getting crucified, which I'm pretty sure not many people have seen in the modern era in many hundreds of years. And they also have a police service that roves around. They have a consumer protection authority, which looks at the different souks and markets and places where you can get food in local areas in Syria, and decides whether a food product is edible or not, essentially in the same way that I guess the FDA would do something. They also have a vigilante aspect of their law and order side, where they burn cigarettes and destroy shrines and tombs. And we saw one of the more larger tombs or shrines in Raqqa being destroyed earlier this year. In terms of public works, they helped build a new market inside of Raqqa. They have an electrical office which helps train and repair electrical services throughout the town. They've had a lot of road work done in some areas as well, where they've rehabilitated roads, whether it's in terms of putting up plants in the medians. And they've also been able to continue operating the Tishreen Dam, which they call Al Farouk now. In addition, they've set up a zakat office, or almsgivings, to provide money for the needy, and they claim that this helped also with farmers in their harvest. They also are now conducting a postal office inside of Raqqa. On the more ideological side of things, they have dawah stalls for their media outlet, Al-Ittisam, where they pass out DVDs of video releases that they've put out online. In addition, they have a dawah truck which roves around with a lot of different things related to Islam and their ideology, and stops in certain areas and talks to children and adults and tries to teach them their interpretations of Islam. In addition, they've set up a number of religious schools for boys and girls, and if you memorize the Quran, you can get a certificate. They also have provided kid fun days where kids can, play around on these inflatable slides and moonwalk type of devices, as well as have food and eating contests. In addition, for older members of the society, they've created sessions for imams and preachers to be trained. In terms of more regular social services type things, they've helped run bread factories and provided fruits and vegetables for many people. And they've even set up a food kitchen for the needy. They also have set up an office for orphans to help register them and then hopefully try and place them with a family. And while the Taliban has been very paranoid about vaccinations after the CIA operation against bin Laden, there have been vaccination programs put out by ISIS in Al-Raqqa province. They even have this Cub Scouts program, which is far more worrying because you have children from the ages around 6 to 14 that are now in these housing places in Raqqa and then put into training camps. So essentially they're having child soldiers being set up as well. So what's next for ISIS now? This is sort of what the potential could be. This is what we're seeing in Syria, but this is what the potential could be in Iraq now that they've taken over some areas. Well, it's likely that they'll try and consolidate their strength with the new money from the Mosul Central Bank, which allegedly is upwards up to $425 million, which is far exceeding any money that Osama bin Laden had. There are already rumors that they've been buying off people inside of Mosul. This will also be used to reinforce the front in Syria. As many people know, earlier this year, a bunch of Syrian rebel groups started an uprising against ISIS and pushed them out of Idlib and Aleppo governorate. It's likely that they use this to further reinforce Al-Raqqa governorate, help out on the Deir ez-Zor front, as well as try and push back into Aleppo and Idlib. Some of the questions I have currently is are they stretched thin? They have 7,000 to 10,000 people, but they span all the way from the countryside in Aleppo all the way up through Mosul now. Can they actually hold this territory? There are many people that obviously do not like their ideology and do not want to live through this. And obviously, the type of penalties that they pursue is created a backlash in the first place last decade in Iraq. We've already seen statements put out by some tribal members in Ramadi and Mosul about how they're going to stand up not only just to the Maliki government, but also to ISIS themselves. The fact is, though, is that the Islamic State is a reality. ISIS's ability to crisscross provinces within its state could prove difficult for completely dislodging it from either territory and could provide more ability to consolidate its proto-state. For jihadists worldwide, the continued battlefield victories registered by ISIS and the perception that the so-called will of God is on its side against numerically superior enemies will only enhance the prestige of joining the group and furthering its goals. So this is the state of ISIS right now. Obviously, it's a lot different than sort of what Al-Qaeda was up to last decade, but it's a very sophisticated and organized organization, and this will be a lot more difficult to dislodge than anything we've seen before. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those sobering remarks. Mike, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, very good. All right. Let me open up a discussion session by asking you, Mike, if you can bring us up to date on the reports concerning Iranian military involvement, who it is, where they are, what do they seem to be doing?
Well, it's very difficult to come up with categorical information on this without being in country and seeing it with your own eyes. You know, I spent a lot of time studying the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and indeed meeting them on many occasions quite unnervingly. Right. But what I found was that they were, well, let's just say the Iranians have been very nervous since 2007 about risking IRGC officers directly inside Iraq. Now, since the US left in 2011, I'm sure some of that fear or trepidation has gone, and we have seen senior IRGC officers killed on the other side of the border over there in Syria. So it's very likely they've got military advisors at key points operating in many ways how I'd like to see US officers operating. You know, one thing's for sure, wherever you've got these US officers operating, you're very unlikely to have Iranian officers operating in the same places. And, you know, that, if anything, that's a good reason for having US officers in the front line, or at least at the front headquarters, to, you know, to ensure that there are some eyes on what's actually happening at this forward edge. But around Samara's critical to this. And, you know, I'd recommend to you all the work of Philip Smythe, who works with the Institute on Shia Islamist groups in Iraq and Syria. Samara is a shrine city. It's the place where the Al-Asqariya shrine was. That was blown up in February 2006, providing the final spark to the civil war that lasted for 2+ years. ISIS tried to overrun it on June the 5th, failed, thank God, about 800 meters short of the shrine. They tried again after the major collapse of security forces. And that's one of those nightmare scenarios that everyone in coalition forces and analysts have been talking about for years. What if they took out the shrine again? And just as Shia Islamist militias from Iraq have been defending the shrines in Syria, in Damascus, so they've been recalled to defend the shrines in Samara. And they'll do the same in Kadamiyya, and they'll do the in northern Baghdad, and they'll do the same in Kerbala. And, you know, where there is one of these Iranian-backed Shia militia actors who are essentially Iraqi version of Lebanese Hezbollah, there will often be an IRGC trainer or advisor not that far behind.
Jim, we just heard Mike say that the Iranians are probably sending IRGC guys doing what he would have expected Americans to be doing on that in a different context. Now, you've been on both sides of this, in Baghdad trying to push the political reconciliation, and in the Situation Room offering advice to presidents on how to and what sort of military force to bring to bear. So could you give us a little glimpse into what you think is happening both angles here? What are we telling specifically to Maliki? The time frame the president announced today was a matter of days, end of the weekend. Is it possible to see the type of political reconciliation that he spoke about in 72 hours? And on the military side, what sort of preparations do you expect are going on right now for the type of action that you would like to see?
Yeah, the president actually spelled out a lot when you mine the statement in bits and pieces and you then sew it all together. There's a pretty good outline of what he's going to be doing over the next few days. What he's saying is, quite rightly, he's got to move assets into place. We've just heard that an aircraft carrier has moved into the Gulf. He talks about intelligence. That's both everything from analysts diverting to other things to focus on this, to satellites, to drones, the entire network of U.S. intelligence systems is going to be turned on to this situation at every level. We were very, very, very good at this in dealing with al-Qaeda from the period roughly 2004 through 2011, and there's a lot of that reserve capability there. Nonetheless, he's also going to be preparing, as will the military, for whatever contingency the president gives the green light to. It's not unwise or unexpected for the president to link this situation with a political developments and reconciliation. What he really means, we're not going to know for a few days, but it would be unwise, I think, for him to reveal his hand by saying, I can say this from the outside, look, we want the Maliki government to be a new and different government and take a different attitude towards the Kurds and the Sunnis, but if ISIS surrounds Baghdad, we're going to hit them anyway, regardless of what the government does or doesn't do. It's irrelevant. He can't say that, even if he has decided to do that, and I have no indication that he has decided to do that, because you always want to leverage what you're doing for an ally or friend with what you want that ally or friend to do for you, particularly when it's in that ally and friend's own interest. And we have spent 11 years talking not just to Maliki, but to every political leader, not just the Shia Arab political leaders, but all of the political leaders, that if they do not hang together, they're going to hang separately, and that's what we're seeing before us today. And so it's good advice that he's giving. In terms of the specifics, you note that Vice President Biden called Maliki yesterday. I'm sure, having been in some of these calls, that the U.S. message was delivered with vigor and with a certain bluntness, and that's good under these conditions. And I'm sure it concluded a very strong admonition that Maliki has to change his approach towards sectarian issues and towards his political domination of the military. It's one of the reasons why the military melted away. Secondly, it also would have included the specifics of what America might offer under what conditions, and we don't know that yet. As I said, it's good that the president isn't signaling both to the enemy, but also before he talks to Congress what exactly he's going to do. And it's also good that he ensures that Maliki feels under pressure to do things in return. Again, this is most important, as the president said, in the days ahead, if we're facing a surge into the Baghdad area, into Kabbalah and Najaf in the south, because that could lead to an extremely dramatic situation, including for our own personnel, and it could lead to a significant Iranian intervention or, as I said before, a significant Kurdish reaction. If ISIS is either slowed down themselves and they're not 8 feet tall, as we've seen in Samarra, as we've seen with the Kurds, people can stand up to these guys. There's not that many of them. They have momentum on their side, and boy, that's important in military affairs. But once they're stopped, then people can hold their ground. So it's possible that the Iraqi government will be able to hold its ground in the non-Sunni Arab areas. If that is so, then we move to the other scenario. And the White House has to be prepared for a longer struggle. Remember, the president's statement yesterday was a permanent presence of al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria will not be tolerated. So he's got to think about how he's going to do this, along with his commitment to the American people not to put boots on the ground, by which he means the 101st Airborne, the 1st Armored Division. So that's the kind of thing that people will be working back and forth. But meanwhile, they will be deluged by 1,001 facts, factoids, irrelevant ideas, and other schemes that constantly torment you. I cannot describe, and some of you have been there, I cannot describe how painful this process is. Anyway.
And then, Aaron, just to complete this circle, you followed ISIS for quite a long time. Given the options that they have in front of them, what are they most likely to do? Go to Baghdad? Hold tight on the current territory? What are they most likely to do?
Well, knowing ISIS and how they've operated in the past, and the excitement that I've seen from all of their followers and supporters online in the past week, is that they're likely to have a big head and potentially overplay themselves in the coming days and weeks. Whether they do that or not is obviously a big question, but based off of past activities, it's likely that they will try and continue to push just because that's how they view the world. In addition to that, I suspect there are already signs that they've, some of the Humvees and other types of military equipment that we saw them take in Mosul are already back in Syria now. So it's likely that they'll now use that, the new infusion of cash and weapons in their front in Deir ez-Zor region, as well as trying to further consolidate al-Raqqa, as well as even potentially push back into Aleppo city. So it's likely that, knowing them, they will try and push on both fronts in Iraq and in Syria. This probably could provide a great opportunity, though, for the Syrian rebels to further fight against ISIS because they are stretching themselves thin, as well as any forces in the Iraqi arena as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll turn to your questions. Start with Andrew Tabler right in the middle. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much for great presentations, guys. We've had a lot of prescriptions from all three of you, and particularly Aaron and Ambassador Jeffrey, on what to do in Iraq, but it seems to me that a lot of this is coming out of Syria. I mean, ISIS was born in Iraq but metastasized in Syria and then came back for a double or nothing game of whatever we have in front of us. We have an organization that does not recognize the Sykes-Picot boundaries, as they call them, that have divided the Middle East for over a century. So my question to you is, and I guess it's to Aaron and Ambassador Jeffrey, but Mike can also chime in, what do we do on the Syria end of this equation, and how does it affect particularly the debate that we've seen recently with Ambassador Robert Ford's call to arm the Sunni opposition in Syria? Thank you.
Very quickly, we had a horrible Syrian situation which threatened to do exactly this kind of game-changing thing for a couple of years, and we didn't do very much about it. It metastasized, and it's the mess we have now. And we're going to have that mess tomorrow, next month, at least, and for months into the future, regardless of what we do or don't do. What's different right now is these guys are moving on a path that, as Aaron indicated, and as I fear, could be an immediate, dramatic game changer to the entire Middle East. And so there's a difference in perspective. And it's very hard to communicate this. I've been trying to do it for 3 days. The President tried to do it and was not completely clear in it. That we have a longer-term problem of a wide swath of Sunni Arab, largely desert territory in the middle of the Levant that has been taken over by one or another terrorist group, as well as, at least in Syria, and to some degree in Iraq, other insurgent groups that are unhappy with the two governments. So it's now it's not really an ungoverned land because there's a variety of forces that are governing it, but many of them do not have our best interests at heart. So it's a tremendously complicated long-term problem that's going to require, as the President said, getting everybody lined up in the region, political solutions, reconciliation, stability operations, and all of that, if we're willing to pay the price and engage that thoroughly. I don't know. He's moving slowly in that direction. But that's a longer-term problem. The immediate problem he has, and he seems to indicate this in his final remarks in answering the question. The speech, as I said, if you mine it and then sew it together, you can kind of get a sort of way forward. But in being asked a question at the very end, then you basically hear him saying, look, this is going to be a few days. I got to get my ducks in order. I know, and it comes closer to, he does realize that if ISIS moves on Baghdad or on some of these other areas, if the Iranians threaten to move in a big way, that he may have to take some immediate decisions. So that's how I would separate it out. Obviously, he knows, because he included it, he knows it's one front. As he said, I cannot allow a permanent refuge, a permanent presence of ISIS al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. He knows it's a common front. How this fits with the battle that he also is waging, sort of, against Assad is a whole other question. But, you know, it's tough being president.
Okay, thank you. Yes, in front here.
Thank you very much. This is one of the very few events that I cannot find anyone to disagree with. You guys really have nailed the issues exactly right. Thank you for the presentations. Let's take us back to the other side, you know, how Iraqis view this. And I think it is very important because they are the ones who are mainly interested in it. The ambassador quite rightly said that this has been the biggest challenge to the U.S. since 9/11. I would say that this is the biggest challenge to the Shia Iraqis, 65% of the population, since 1991. As someone who still carries the scars from the uprising of 1991, can the United States afford another perception of a betrayal by the United States, which means this time a permanent gift, all the Shia, to Iran, if Iran comes to the rescue and the United States drags its feet, making conditions where people are expecting the friend, the preferred ally to interfere? I would like to see the United States to solve the situation, not the Iranians or someone else, because that will be at a cost to the Iraqis and to the United States. Your thoughts on that? And I think this is very important to really address and for the administration to understand.
Okay, I'll take a first stab at that. And you hit on a very important point. And for those of us, you remember, as ambassador, I apologized for 1991 publicly. Here's the problem, and I'm being very honest, folks. The United States can essentially take almost any loss and live with it. That's what makes us such a complicated ally for everybody. We can lose Vietnam, and did, and live to fight another day in Kosovo and in Kuwait. And so the short answer is, yeah, we can survive with the Shia of Iraq, feeling that we have totally abandoned them, because there are other people, the Tibetans and others, who feel we've totally abandoned them. And I think that probably the Turkomen of Crimea are not feeling too good about us right now either. But we can move on, because that is the reality. But there's another reality. You do this enough, you do this often enough, you develop a pattern of supporting people and then walking away from them, and then demanding that all the T's are crossed or the I's are dotted before you will move the world's biggest, 10 times more expensive than the next, more expensive than the next 10 militaries combined, force, then people are going to start organizing themselves in our world differently, and we're not going to like that organization. So in that sense, the Shia have a vote just like the Tibetans and the Crimeans and everybody else, and the Sunni Arabs have a vote. A lot of them aren't happy with us abandoning them either, those tribes and those other people that we know so well, and the Kurds aren't too happy.
Yes, Barbara Slavin, we'll work our way around.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for doing this. My question is about Maliki. Can he be part of the solution? He's had 8 years. He has done nothing but go after Sunnis, Kurds, become increasingly paranoid, corrupt, appoint his relatives. Can he actually rise to the occasion?
Don't look at me. Look at Mr. Knight. See?
Mike, what do you think?
I've got to be able to get back into
Let's get the volume up here, please.
I'll be diplomatic, as I travel to Iraq quite frequently. I think, first of all, you've got to respect the election result, including perhaps the personal vote too, which is an indication that at least in Baghdad, Maliki could put a lot of votes together. But that's ducking the question, I guess. Realistically, if we look back over the last 4 years, it has been a dismal failure. There's some the relationship with Kuwait, the oil production, but everything else has been a dismal failure, and really it's been brought about by failures in the Iraqi government rather than how great the bad guys are. And one has to wonder, when we look back in 2018, at the 2014 to 2018 term, whether we see more of the same or whether we see a turnaround, as we saw during 2006 to 2010 term. And that's the key, whoever leads Iraq next, that's the key question they should be asking themselves. How are they going to be remembered? As the guy who lost it all, or as the guy who did whatever he had to do and dealt with whoever he had to deal with to keep it together? The Maliki government, when I was there in March, they explained, a lot of the key leadership explained exactly what they were going to do in a third term. And some of it was encouraging, increasing support for technocrats, a streamlined decision-making system in a good way. I'm not just talking about taking all the power for yourself, but actually building a real civil service. Many ideas. But there's also a real darkness at the heart of the vision for the next 4 years. If there's engagement with the Sunnis, it's about creating a new class of Sunnis from the tribal and political groups at low level, and trying to completely reduce and eradicate the national level leadership of the Sunnis. It struck me that the Sunnis that wanted to support the sense of there being a Sunni community, the Sunnah, who could work together, those people are the ones that the Iraqi government were planning to continue persecuting. And if they were going to involve Sunnis in future government, the plan was really to create a new class of Sunnis that they could deal with and that they could also control. And that's an extraordinarily dark vision for the next 4 years. My hope is, as I put in a recent piece with the Institute, that this may be a catalyst. Sometimes in Iraq, you have to get right to the edge of the cliff, or even take a bit of a step over the edge before people do the right thing. And so my feeling is, if the electorate had voted heavily against Maliki, then this would all be clear-cut. But they didn't. So let's not focus on replacing the man. Let's focus on changing the policies.
Here. Are we convinced that, in Maliki's view, he can't have both Iranian support and American support? Is there any way for Maliki to think that there's a choice here? Do we know that?
I think he feels that he can have both. And he knows he can have both because he has had both for a long time. And of course, you know, we know one of the ironic facts of Iraq is that often US and Iranian policy push towards the same choices, even if they do so for completely different motivations. So he feels like he can have both. And I would rather see far stronger American influence. And to be honest, I think it is a bit of a zero-sum game in terms of the more we give, the less of a vacuum they fill. You know, Rob, from everything we've done at the Institute, that the Iranians will always fill a vacuum. And if we create this vacuum to an even greater extent than it exists today, if we don't feel this gasping need for support right now, they can point to their track record in Syria, where they've frankly been rather successful. And you know, that's going to be very powerful to the Maliki government. I just want to mention one final thing, which was shocking to me personally when I was over there in March in Baghdad. Speaking to some of the most senior Sunni leaders, I started to hear things that I hadn't heard before, such as, do you think we should go to Iran to negotiate with them? Do you think if they're going to run everything, shouldn't we just finally make our peace with them? And I heard that from some leaders I never believed that I would hear that from, because they were starting to vote with their feet.
Okay, thank you very much. Maury Amite and Dave Pollock. Maury, turn around. Just talk. Just talk.
Can we expect any support at all from any of our allies, Britain or France, or the Saudis? Do they have any role to play here?
Jim, what do you think? Allies.
Allies. Well, we saw what happened with the Brits on Syria. it would be a further complication. The president has talked in his speech about this is a regional issue, and he's right, and he needs to coordinate with and have support from the Sunni allies, and that means, of course, Turkey, Jordan, and he didn't say Sunni allies, he said friends, and but we all know he's talking about Turkey, Jordan, and particularly the Gulf states, and when you talk about the Gulf states, you start with Saudi Arabia. And where's Simon? Well, there's a piece that Simon did in the Policy Watch just yesterday, and the foreign policy picked it up on the issue of how the Saudi leadership sees this. And to some degree, and I've had experience with the top leadership in Saudi Arabia, and I can attest to this, they see things in a very stark Sunni Shia war for the control of the Middle East way. Not everybody thinks that way. King Abdullah of Jordan doesn't think that way, even though he doesn't have many Shia Arabs in his country. Others don't think that way. Many of the Sistani doesn't think that way. Many of the Sunni Arabs don't think that way in Iraq. But so the Saudis, on the other hand, are extraordinarily worried about the al-Qaeda threat. You see how actively they combat it in Yemen, directly and indirectly through helping us, and now they're going to have a major al-Qaeda presence not in the Fatah of Pakistan, but on their border, Anbar province borders, Saudi Arabia. So, welcome to the war on terror.
Okay. Dave Pollack.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just pick up on a number issue. I think, Aaron, you said that there were 7,000 to 10,000 ISIS fighters. Is that a pretty solid estimate? And is it possible that because of this momentum, as several of you put it, that they will pick up lots of new recruits, either by intimidation or by cash bonuses or by zeal or whatever, in the next, even just the next few days? Thank you.
Yeah, a number of analysts believe that it's sort of in the 7,000 to 10,000 range, though the majority of those are probably actually in Syria because they have been governing the area. It's believed that probably about 5,000 of those are actually inside of Syria, so maybe 2,000 to 3,000 have been in Iraq. In the past week, they have had some prison breaks again, and that's let out a couple thousand individuals. Whether these individuals were just criminals or whether they were previously in the group or whether they're just in prison for political reasons. There are stories that some of them have joined up with ISIS. Obviously, I can't confirm it being in Washington, but it's definitely possible that more people will join up. Plus, people like Victor's, they don't want to get their heads lopped off. So even if somebody doesn't necessarily agree with the ideology, if they're being protected and not being killed, you could see people joining up.
And so it's merely this 2,000 to 5,000 person force that is marching hundreds of kilometers and taking town after town after town.
Well, there are also Ba'athist and other types of forces as well, and it didn't really help that the Iraqi military didn't really stand up for much of a fight.
Yeah, and read the early history of the expansion of Islam under the first caliphs. It was small flying columns of people from the Hindu Kush to Spain that were carrying the flag.
Yes, sir. Right behind you. No. That's great, Sam. Go ahead. Right.
Hanif Kashani, Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. I wanted to ask you, the panel, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, famously told General Petraeus that he runs Iran's Iraq policy. And he no doubt is obviously probably in Baghdad, but I wanted to ask if the pace of these developments reveal that Soleimani maybe isn't as strong as he's projected to be, or if this is a one-time fluke that basically caught everybody by surprise.
Yeah, I'll take the Qasem Soleimani question. He, in the larger scheme of things, as long as we weren't a threat to Iran out of Iraq, which by 2004, 2005 they concluded we weren't, they ran an economy of force operation there because they had bigger fish to fry with their internal situation, with the nuclear count, and of course, for the last almost 3 years, Syria, and spreading their revolution in various Shia areas. Qasem Soleimani bears a lot of the responsibility for this. A, because he was the guy who did not press people who he urged to play roles to reach out to the Sunni population. And I was always a bit surprised at that because generally Iran is careful in its policies towards Iraq. It hasn't told the Iraqis, hey, stop increasing your oil production. You're making possible the sanctions against Iran, which is exactly what's happening. They're very careful and reasoned and prudent in what they ask of their friends, which is not always what the American government does, so I spot that sometimes, including when I was in the American government. But nonetheless, the core goal of Iran and Iraq, as far as I understand it, apart from not having an American army poised to go across the border, is not to have Iraq fall apart and jihadists from one direction and a Turkish-Kurdish alliance from the other be on their borders. And that's what that guy has delivered. So somebody should be asking some questions in Tehran right now about how he's handled his account.
So you mentioned it, and I know we're going to lose Mike shortly. So I want to ask first Mike and then Jim about the Kurdish-Turkish angle of this. Mike, you did lay out a couple of possible routes that the Kurds may go. What do you think is the most likely of these alternatives you laid out? And Jim, you made reference to the Turkish conundrum right now because of its people under being held hostage. Broadly speaking, though, do you expect the Turks to be an assertive actor in this sort of squeezing of ISIS, working perhaps with the United States in this effort? Mike, you want to go first? Can we try to get the volume here? Mike? Oh, okay, great. Well, then, Jim.
It's very hard to fathom exactly how the Turks view radical Islamic groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIL, al-Nusra people, essentially the Salafists. We know how they view the Muslim Brothers, and that is as their allies. This is the top Turkish government officials, not necessarily others in the Turkish state, but they see those as their brothers. And I think that there's an ambivalence, but it isn't necessarily an enmity. Here's the question: why didn't they pull their people out of Mosul? 500,000 refugees got out of there. There were Kurdish positions not just north, east, and west of the city, but in the city. Relations between the KRG and Ankara couldn't be better, and every embassy, believe me, of any country in the world has an evacuation plan. Even here in Washington, I bet the embassies have evacuation plans. And
where are you going to go?
But it would have involved hopping in a vehicle and driving for 10 minutes into across the line into a Kurdish area. They didn't take that decision. Somebody needs to ask why, but Turkey right now is not the kind of democracy that will lend itself to a review of that. So I think that, first of all, when you have 80 hostages, that becomes, as we all learned in 1979, that becomes job one. There are all kinds of options, including, it's never off the table, military action, as it was not off the table with us with Desert One. But by and large, you're totally fixated on that problem, and everything else fades. The Turks have lived with al-Nusra and with the ISIL on their border in some areas for some time in Syria. They really don't have a border with these guys in Iraq. Essentially, the entire Turkish, I would have to look at the map and I have to look at what developments have been in the last few days, but by and large, the bulk of the border with Turkey and Iraq is in the hands of the Peshmerga, and the little tiny bit that runs west to Syria, I'll bet, is under the effective control of the Peshmerga right now. So therefore, they don't have an immediate problem beyond the refugee, not the refugee, beyond the hostage situation, and that's a big one for them. So that's going to divert their attention to anything of a strategic nature until they can fix this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Stanley on the left.
Iran has been mentioned. Iran, according to recent reports, has boots on the ground in Iraq now. And according to a report today, is making overtures to the United States to work together on this issue. Should we respond to that? Should we try to work with Iran? If so, should we attach some conditions? And if then, what should those conditions be?
Jim?
If we want to maintain our vision of it, in the end, unified Iraq, and that's what President Obama laid out, and we want to be able to deal with the Kurds and deal with the Sunni Arabs, we have to be very careful about any appearance of dealing with the Iranians. Now, we've talked to them in the Petraeus Crocker era. We actually met with Qasem Soleimani's representatives in Baghdad, and you know, it's not totally an on-off situation with the Iranians, but it's pretty close to it. And I would say the other thing is you're going to have a hard time. I mean, I can see some of the looks in this audience. Imagine the rest of the American public. You're going to have a hard time selling any kind of bold military operation, which is a hard sell in this town and in this country right now anyway, if it involves, you know, making an alliance with the Iranians of all people. So my recommendation would be they are Iranian boots on the ground. They have always been Iranian boots on the ground. We have sometimes grabbed the Iranian boots on the ground, and they're going to continue to be boots on the ground here and there. If they're here and there, it's just something, you know, it's like, you know, there's scorpions all over the place too. You just have to deal with a threat, something unpleasant that's out there. But the idea of a U.S. condominium to save Iraq from being overrun by Sunni warriors, that would be a hard sell in Riyadh, and it would be a hard sell in Washington, I think.
Okay, is Mike, are you with us? Okay, fine. Let's proceed. Any further questions? Then I'm going to close just with this last question. I know this isn't this really isn't very fair, but why not? So, Jim, a week from now, do you expect the use of American military force in Iraq?
Yes, before I elaborate, I want to say the scorpion analogy was not to the Iranian population or the Iranian ethnic group. It was to the IRGC guys. They've earned it. But in terms of that question, I think almost certainly, Rob, unless ISIS somehow is stopped in its tracks by an Iraqi army that showed little ability to do that other than briefly in Samarra, I think the situation will get sufficiently desperate that we will have military action.
Okay. Friends, thank you very much for joining us here today at the Washington Institute.
Thank you. I like it. We still might bring back